We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rachel Clifton, and I'll be your presenter for today's webinar, An Advocate's Guide to Emergency Medicaid Services in Tennessee. Thank you for joining us, and for those who are seeking continuing education credit with the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance, please be sure to let me know after the webinar, and I will send you a certificate of completion. Especially those who are tuning in together as an office, I can only see the person who registered their name as an attendee. So if you're watching it as a group, please be sure to send me everyone's name who's in the group and who wants the CE credit. Okay, so starting off, I'm really going to go through the Emergency Medicaid Services Toolkit that we've created for you guys and for providers as well, if there are providers on this webinar, to use when applying for emergency medical services. And I sent out an email this morning, and I apologize I didn't get that to you on Friday. I was out sick when the email was supposed to go out. But I sent you guys an email this morning that contains a link to that Emergency Medicaid Services Tool Guide. And the link is up here on the slide now. I know you guys can't access it during the webinar, but it's uploaded to the webinar, and then the links will work in PDF form when I send out the slides after the webinar. So if you don't have this toolkit in front of you, please pause your screen on the webinar, go ahead and get it, because you're going to need it as I talk through, especially the how to apply process. Okay, so moving on. Again, my name is Rachel Clifton. I am a paralegal and the training coordinator here at Tennessee Justice Center. My email is rclifton@tnjustice.org, and most of you who know me know you can email or call me anytime you guys have questions. Okay, so let's start with the agenda for today. The main focus here of this webinar is to tell you how to use, how to apply for emergency Medicaid following TennCare's guidelines. TennCare did release new guidelines last summer of the summer of 2015, and then how to use the appeal process to address delays and denials, especially with emergency Medicaid applications. I'm also going to go into how the appeal process can be used to move the effective date of coverage back to the original date on which the paper application was mailed to the Federally Facilitated Marketplace, FFM, or faxed to Tennessee Health Connection. So some learning goals for you guys. And to get to that point where you guys hopefully learn, the agenda is going to be going over some background, why we are in the position that we're in, and then definition of emergency medical services, what are the requirements that the incident has to meet in order to be eligible for emergency medical services, and then how to apply for either you're in a hospital, you're applying for a patient, or you're the advocate who the patient is seeing after being in the hospital. Hopefully, if you're the latter, somebody's already done the application for the individual in the hospital, since applying retroactively for emergency medical services isn't going to be useful at all, either to the hospital or to the individual who is admitted to the ER. So then finally we'll end with how to submit documentation. And this really is for both sides. This is for providers as well as it is for advocates who are helping through the appeal process. And again, here's the Emergency Medicaid Services Toolkit that's on our website. It was the link that's on the screen now, and the link that I sent around this morning is a slightly outdated version. The only thing that we've changed is on page 1, and that's in the background section. So the rest of the content is mostly the same, and the one that has been recreated as of today is on our website now. I again apologize that that updated Toolkit didn't get sent out to you guys. I was sick on Friday when it was supposed to go out. So, okay, moving on. Let's start with background. So why are we in this position that we're in Tennessee, especially in the context of applying for emergency Medicaid services? So as many of you guys know, since January 2014, Tennessee has required that almost all applications for Medicaid, which we call TennCare here in Tennessee, be submitted to the federally facilitated marketplace, or what some people call FFM, online exchange, insurance exchange, insurance marketplace, multiple names. Some people just call it Obamacare, but we're gonna call it the FFM in this webinar, and the toolkit as well. The Tennessee Department of Human Services, DHS, no longer accepts applications. Most of you guys know this, but this was a policy change that went into effect at the end of 2013, very beginning of 2014. And the only exception to this current state policy are applications for the Long-Term Services and Supports Program, known as Choices. That's the, you're going to use the LTSS streamlined application for that. And I believe that is in your toolkit on, let me see, it is appendix, it's not in here, it's something that I will link to later in the webinar. Yeah, it's not in your toolkit, but it is linked to later on. So continuing on, you use the same application for the Medicare Savings Program, and then you use a different application to apply for emergency medical services. That's the streamlined FFM application that you use to apply for TennCare and Cover Kids. So these applications can be submitted by fax, Tennessee Health Connection, the Communication Center for TennCare. So prior to the summer of 2015, when I mentioned that TennCare made a change in its policy for submitting emergency Medicaid applications, the state did require all applications, including emergency Medicaid applications, to go through the FFM because non-qualified immigrants often don't have Social Security numbers. It was very difficult, sometimes impossible in the earlier days, to get these applications through the marketplace. So unless you were applying for an individual who was lawfully present but just did not hold a qualified status such that he was eligible for Medicaid or TennCare, you're probably going to have trouble getting him through the online application on healthcare.gov. So there was a better route, the phone. Some people, depending on the call rep you got at the marketplace, could push the application through and get you through the identity verification stage without a Social Security number. From all accounts I've heard recently, this process is moving a lot quicker and better through the marketplace. So, but back in the days, the only real option for submitting an application for emergency Medicaid services was by submitting a paper application to the FFM in London, Kentucky. Unfortunately, coverage can't take effect before the date of application. That is, a state rule we have with our Medicaid program. And so a mailed application is not considered filed until it's actually received at the London, Kentucky facility, which meant that the application effective date was going to be delayed at least one day, and in more cases, more than one day. And so that meant hospitals, would lose potentially the most expensive day of admission, the first day of admission, since you weren't going to get the application dated back to that original attempt to apply. If somebody's, say, applying today, March 28th, mailing it in today, perhaps London, Kentucky didn't receive it until March 29th, anything that happened today might not be covered, and in most cases wouldn't be covered. So the state, realizing that they need to address these delays caused by mailing a paper application to London, Kentucky, implemented a new policy in the summer of 2015 instructing hospitals to fax the Tennessee Health Connection a copy of the FFM application along with medical records at the time the FFM application is filed. Now, I do want to stop there and mention that that's not always something that people have at the time of admission and the emergent situation. So we do want to stress that it's totally fine to go ahead and fax the application and then supplement that application with the medical records once you have them. You just want to make sure you don't drop the ball on submitting that supplemental information at all. So once this new process was implemented, there were still some issues within the Healthcare Finance Administration that created problems for many applicants. And these problems are mostly, manifesting in delays or erroneous denials of applications. So I'm going to go through delays a little bit now. That's not the point of this webinar. That's a different webinar on the Wilson v. Gordon lawsuit. But just for some background, reasonable promptness is a federal law that requires TennCare and all, state Medicaid agencies who are accepting federal funds to run their program to respond to an applicant's application with reasonable promptness. And this is defined as no longer than 45 days. And so for anyone who's applying for emergency Medicaid, they should and have a right to receive an eligibility determination within 45 days of that application. I'm sure many people are chuckling to themselves at this point in the presentation because I know I have never seen an emergency Medicaid application responded to that quickly. So the federal law goes on to say that people have a right to a fair hearing if their application is denied or is not acted upon within reasonable promptness. So that's why we kind of expanded the Emergency Medicaid Toolkit to go into how to get through the appeal process and use it to your advantage as an advocate or provider to make sure that coverage goes back to that original date and that both the provider and the individual are kind of off the hook there. So moving on, after we filed the Wilson v. Gordon lawsuit, the Judge Campbell did order that on or after October 1st, 2013, Medicaid applicants who have not received a final eligibility determination in 45 days, or in the case of disability, 90 days, and who have not been given the opportunity for a fair hearing by the state defendants after this time period have run, do get to file a delayed appeal and have a decision on whether or not their application has been delayed within 45 days of filing that delayed appeal. So hopefully most of you guys tuned in to our webinar series last week talking about how to file delay appeals and how to build a record for those. Again, there's not time to go into that now, but I have linked to that presentation in this slide deck, and it's also the recorded webinar is on our website, and the slide deck is on our website as well. So, okay, moving on. Despite this new process that the state came up with in the summer of 2015, again, like I said, there are still communication failures within the Healthcare Finance Administration, HCFA, that created these delays and erroneous denials of applications. So, this goes without saying, but these delays and denials are especially problematic for hospitals seeking reimbursement for the emergency care of non-qualified immigrants. They're problematic for the applicants themselves because, I don't know the exact date, but, after a few months, they're probably going to be sent to collections for these bills. So destroying somebody's credit for something that they have applied for and done their due diligence and seeking isn't necessarily fair. And that's kind of the story that we hear from most of our clients who are applying for emergency medical aid services, that they're bearing the burden of the state's delay and are really, trying to do their best to pay these bills as best they can in small doses. But when the bills are hundreds of thousands of dollars, a payment plan of $10, $20 a month isn't going to be acceptable to most providers. So After the application is submitted to the FFM by mail, which is what the state said that you should do, and also fax the Tennessee Health Connection, it's still common for the application to go for months without any action. And as the application is being processed, a letter is often sent to the patient demanding information or documentation within 10 days of the date stamp on that letter. So if the information is not received within that time, the application is denied, and the hospital is, left with this huge unpaid bill. Patient is left with, what do I do now? I'm being sent to collections. I can't afford to pay this. And the advocate might feel like, holy moly, what am I supposed to do? This feels so much bigger than me. So have no fear. That's what this toolkit's for, to kind of give you a legal basis and walk you through the steps to seeking a determination of eligibility on that original application and making sure it dates back to that original date. Okay, so important takeaways for you guys. The law is on your side, and it is possible to obtain emergency Medicaid using the appeal process. I've heard so many people say, but emergency Medicaid doesn't exist in Tennessee, and that's not true. I don't know if you've heard that or if it's just been saved for my ears. I hope it's just been saved for my ears, but that's not true. It is something that is an option. It's an open category of TennCare. So it's just a more difficult category of TennCare to apply for. And in order to succeed, you must have a process that actively works and documents these cases in a manner that's most likely beyond the capacity of patients. And then, we do want to acknowledge it is a hassle, but that's why we created this toolkit, so that you guys have, clean steps to follow in order to get a proper determination of eligibility and hopefully enrollment in emergency Medicaid services. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the toolkit. Hopefully you guys all have it in front of you. I'm going to start on page 2 with a definition of emergency Medicaid. So here's that link to the resource that I'm talking about if you guys are tuning in later. Federal law does require that state Medicaid programs cover emergency medical services for ineligible aliens. And this is, why it kind of makes me crazy to hear people say that emergency Medicaid isn't an option in Tennessee. It absolutely is, and federal law requires it to be an open category of Medicaid. But when these individuals are otherwise categorically and financially eligible for Medicaid and submit an application for emergency Medicaid services while they're having an emergent situation, then that would basically be your groundwork for eligibility for an individual. Approval of an emergency Medicaid application only provides coverage for a single episode of care. So that is to say, it's not ongoing. It's not that, if somebody applies today, they get the 12 months of coverage that most TennCare categories provide. It is only going to cover, the time that somebody's admitted to the ER and then, released from the emergent situation, even if that person is released from the ER into inpatient or acute care. That's no longer, most likely going to be considered emergent anymore. And at that point, the emergency Medicaid is going to terminate. So furthermore, the coverage, emergency Medicaid coverage is limited to the length of time required to stabilize the emergent episode, and only the services involved in the emergency itself will be reimbursed. So that's important to understand as an advocate, to know when you should stop fighting, when the state has paid for the services it is responsible to pay for, and when the services received are outside of the definition of emergency Medicaid services. So in essence, to get you to the point of where you can decide, okay, what services are going to be covered, what services are not, we came up with a 4-prong test. And here it is on page 2, but it's also in your slide now. First prong is the patient is undocumented or a non-qualified immigrant. and I'm not going to go into this too much today. Your toolkit does talk about it, and I also link to the webinar that was, I believe, 2 weeks ago on immigrant eligibility for TennCare. But this webinar is the final webinar in a Lunch and Learn series, and they all kind of build on each other. So hopefully you guys have been following us in the previous 3 webinars this month. So prong number 2 is going to be the care meets the standard of emergency care. Prong 3, the patient's condition meets the sudden onset requirements. And finally, the 4th prong is the patient is otherwise categorically and financially eligible for Medicaid. So in order to qualify for EMS, the patient must pass all 4 prongs. It's not one or the other, 2 out of 3. No, it's all 4. You can't just pick and choose which ones your patient is going to meet. So, and including, especially whether or not your patient is otherwise categorically and financially eligible to receive Medicaid. In other words, the patient's immigration status is the sole reason he is ineligible for full Medicaid coverage. This I hear probably most frequently is something that people don't realize about EMS. And sometimes I've even read transcripts from HCSA appeal hearings about with TennCare itself arguing that anyone who's undocumented can get emergency Medicaid services, and that's just not what the federal policy says. It's not what TennCare policy says either. So I do want to stress that in order for, especially if you're referring a case to TJC, in order for us to be able to advocate and find a legal ground for that individual, we're first going to be screening to see if there is a category, an open category of TennCare that they would otherwise be eligible for if they had a qualified immigration status. If we don't think that person has a qualified immigration status, then we couldn't pursue emergency Medicaid for that individual because there's not a legal ground for us to argue on. And this toolkit only addresses the first 3 prongs of this 4-prong test. And the reason, again, why we're not going into the 4th prong and really some of the other ones is because of time. This is an hour-long webinar, so we're going to have to focus on defining emergency Medicaid and then refer you guys to previous webinars in order to get the information that you need to conduct the other steps of the 4-prong test. So let's break this down. First one is the patient is an undocumented or non-qualified alien. So federal regulations and the TennCare Medicaid TennCare Standard Policy Manual use the terms undocumented alien and undocumented immigrant, while the TennCare Policy Manual titled Emergency Medical Services uses the terms undocumented and ineligible aliens. For the purposes of this webinar and the toolkit, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably. I most often will use undocumented immigrant and non-qualified immigrant. And the main differences between those are broken down on page 3. When I say undocumented immigrant, I mean somebody who has entered the U.S. without any qualified status. They're not lawfully present. They do not have permission to be here. When I say non-qualified immigrant, I'm typically referring to somebody who might be here lawfully, but who doesn't have a status such that they'd be eligible for TennCare. And perhaps they have a status like green card, but they haven't held that status and for the sufficient time period in order to qualify them for TennCare. So there's not too big of a differentiation, because in the end, you're going to be ineligible for Medicaid if you're either undocumented or have a non-qualified status. And hopefully, as long as you meet the categorical requirements of an open category of TennCare, eligible for emergency Medicaid services. So we did a immigration webinar 2 weeks ago, and that webinar is on our website. The link is below. The YouTube recording is linked there. And I know you guys can't click on it now, but just know that it's there for you. if you need to go off and view it afterwards. Slide deck is also available on our website, and this link will be, you'll be able to click on these once I send them out in an email as a PDF. So if you go back to your toolkit on pages 3 and 4, it's going to break down immigration statuses kind of in big sections, talking about the 5-year bar and who's really going to be subject to that, who's not going to be subject to it. So let's move on to the second prong. Second prong is the care meets the standard of emergency care. So an emergency medical condition is, by definition, the sudden onset of a medical condition manifesting itself by acute symptoms of sufficient severity, including severe pain, such that the absence of immediate medical attention could reasonably be expected to result in any one of the following: placing the patient's health in serious jeopardy, serious impairment of bodily functions, or serious dysfunction of any bodily organ or part. So this is typically going to be something that is decided by the hospital, whether or not the symptoms of the applicant are in line with an emergent situation. The third prong goes hand in hand with the second prong, and it is that the patient's condition meets the sudden onset requirement. So what we mean by this, and again I'm on page 5 if you want to follow along with me, sudden onset is a further qualifier that specifically excludes services for individuals who need ongoing routine care, such as dialysis, chemotherapy, for conditions that could become emergency medical conditions in the future. So things that are going to count as an emergency medical condition are things like labor and delivery, heart attack, I guess if you had some kind of stomach or intestinal issue, appendix rupture, something like that. Things that aren't going to count as an emergency are going to be care and services related to an organ transplant procedure for immigrants not lawfully admitted for permanent residence. Those are not covered. And again, if somebody's referring a case to us that we know, for example, the hospital might have done an application for dialysis or for chemotherapy for an individual, we know that's not a service that is included in Tennessee's emergency Medicaid services. We wouldn't be able to accept that case because, again, we couldn't find a legal argument to make for that individual that he is actually eligible for emergency Medicaid if he was applying for dialysis. That's typically not something that would even be done in the ER, even if somebody had to be admitted to the emergency room for, vitals. They'd then be sent up typically to a different floor of the hospital to receive the dialysis or chemotherapy. So in a nutshell, we're talking about care that's going to be when somebody's in crisis and when somebody's been admitted to the ER and stays in the ER. So the fourth prong, and I've talked about this, but I just want to reiterate, this is when the patient is otherwise categorically and financially eligible for Medicaid. There has to be an open category of TennCare for this person, whether there's a minor in the home that the applicant is the primary caregiver of, or the individual is pregnant, or the individual is a minor with income below the children's category of TennCare income limit. There has to be categorical and financial eligibility such that this person would be eligible for TennCare but for their immigration status. And for more information about what those open categories of TennCare are, TJC did a 2-day training back in October, and we recorded those 2 days. Both of those 2 days are on file with the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance, and it's my understanding that you can still receive CE credit for watching a recorded version of a course that was on file. It didn't have to be attended live, in other words. So the toolkit that we developed is another resource for people. I've linked to that as well as the 2-day training in this slide. So if you guys need the background on, wait, what does Rachel mean by they have to be categorically and financially eligible, I'm going to have to refer you guys to those trainings. As you can see, it's a big whopping training. It took us 2 days to get through. So hopefully you guys understand why I can't stop and explain that now. Okay, so moving along, we're going to go to pages 6 and 7 of the Emergency Medicaid Toolkit to talk about the steps to apply for emergency Medicaid. These steps, we believe, and we've seen results with increasing the likelihood of a patient's treatment being covered by TennCare, by emergency Medicaid, and they are a combination of the procedural steps outlined in the TennCare policy manual and the delay application appeals desk guide that's dated back about a year ago, April 27, 2015, as well as our experiences navigating the application and eligibility determination process of the FFM and Healthcare Finance Administration. So let's start with step 1. Again, we're on page 6 of the Emergency Medicaid Toolkit. And I want to note before we start on all these steps that please, 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 we cannot stress enough that that you save records of everything that you do, that you maintain a meticulous log of all your pending emergency Medicaid applications, what you've done, when you've appealed, what documentation you've sent in, all the letters requesting information or denial or whatever the state has sent in response to that person. So let's start with step 1. Download and print a paper application, and the URL is included in the Emergency Medicaid Toolkit. Complete the paper application and have the patient or family member to sign it. Make a duplicate copy of the signed application. Now, I have heard some discussion of who's actually allowed to sign an application for individual. We've had a few cases come in where TennCare is saying, no, 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 the individual has to sign it himself. His wife's signature isn't good enough, and that's bogus. They have specific outlines of who is an authorized representative that can be the signee on an application, and if you guys would like to see those, that criteria of who could be an authorized representative, please let me know by typing into the chat box so I can send that information in my follow-up email. Okay, moving on to step 2. After they fill out this paper application, send 1 copy by express delivery or certified mail with return receipt requested to the marketplace. The state still maintains that this step has to be done, or as of summer 2015, the last we heard, the state was still saying that this is a step that needs to be done. It's not sufficient in and of itself. To fill out the application and fax it to Tennessee Health Connection, you still do have to mail it to the marketplace as well. So step 3, complete TennCare's Tennessee Healthcare Finance Administration authorization of representative organization form. Try to say that 10 times in a row. It's a doozy. And that's included in this toolkit. Appendix 1, it's front and back. So once you're at this point, and hopefully it's at the same point that you do the application for the individual, have this printed out, have them sign it, have yourself sign it on the back, add it to the case file, go ahead and send it with the application to Tennessee Health Connection, and request that you are CC'd on all future correspondence regarding this application, so that anytime you're, the state's requesting information for this application, you're notified as well. And then step 4, using TennCare's Emergency Medical Services cover sheet, which is Appendix 2, fax a copy of the FFM paper application, including proof of mail from step 2. So if you have that receipt, the return receipt that you requested be signed, include that. And then also include the medical records to document the existence of an emergency pursuant to the definitions above two Tennessee House connection at 1-855-315-0669. So the reason the records are important are basically prong 2 and 3 of our 4-prong test. In order to know if somebody's actually going to be eligible for emergency Medicaid services, you have to have that record, the medical record that's proving this was an emergency situation, and also there was sudden onset of this. The appendix ruptured unexpectedly. Somebody was in active labor. So we need to have those records so that TennCare can even make a determination of whether or not this person qualifies for emergency Medicaid. Sometimes it's not TennCare's fault. If advocates and providers are not providing that information for them to make that determination, they can't rule on whether or not somebody is actually eligible for this category. You have to make sure you're giving everything to the state that they need to determine if somebody is eligible or ineligible for emergency Medicaid. So when you are when you're faxing in the application with the emergency Medicaid medical services cover sheet, and that's Appendix 2, the copy of the paper application from Step 2, and the medical records, write the words EMS application in all caps on the top of every page submitted to Tennessee Health Connection. This is something that the state requested when they did a webinar on emergency Medicaid back in summer of 2015. So there's, go ahead and do it. There's no harm in doing it. You want to make sure it's clear to the to TennCare that this is an emergency Medicaid application that you're submitting. And then with the exception of labor and delivery, note the very specific nature of the emergency and that it could not have been foreseen. So again, this is kind of back to proving that this was an emergent situation and that there was a sudden onset. You might not have those medical records at the time if this is something that you're doing on the day of admission to the ER. So writing a brief note explaining, this person was admitted to our ER on March 28th for a heart attack. Maybe even further information on why that person's, categorically or financially eligible if you have the information at that time. Failure to do this, as well as advance requests for coverage, will result in the application being denied for failure to meet the sudden onset requirements. Again, TennCare can't make a determination of eligibility if they don't have the information they need to make that determination. And sometimes the notices that you guys get from TennCare saying we need more information don't specifically lay out what they need. They don't say we need medical records to prove sudden onset. So you might not know what they're asking for, but if you know what you're required to send in, you know what they're going to be looking at in order to determine somebody eligible for EMS, go ahead and send that to them as soon as you have it so they don't have to request it from you, so you don't have to try to guess what they need from you. Just stay a step ahead of them. And then finally, if anybody tuned into our webinars last week on appeals and applications, you know how to keep a case record. If you didn't tune in, I can't go into it now, but those webinars are on our website as well as the slide decks. And just to reiterate some information from those webinars, it is something that we recommend all advocates and providers do, that as soon as possible, start gathering information from the individual, from the applicant. Proof of income, proof of immigration status, so on and so forth. And we do have an appendix in here that kind of tells you what income counts. It's Appendix 3. It lists, type of income and then the proof that TennCare said can be submitted and counted as proof of income. So if you can, especially if you're a provider, Not everybody knows they're going to the ER that day. Not many people walk around with proof of income or proof of immigration status in their pockets. So this might be something that you can't get immediately, but make a note to yourself that you need it, so that especially if you're going to be following up with the application, if you're in rev cycle, for example, then you know you guys don't have this on file. Somebody at your hospital has submitted a HCFA authorized representative organization form, and so you guys are going to be CC'd on all future requests for more information sent by the state. So if there is ever a request for information or immigration status, you guys get that, you have it on file, you can pull it from your file, send it in to them, and you don't even have to wait those 10 days. Or, run the risk of your patient not getting in the information within 10 days. Okay, so last thing on step 4 is fax the application on the date of admission if possible, even if medical records aren't yet available. And again, we don't have retroactive coverage in Tennessee. So the application is only going to be as good as the date it is sent in to Tennessee Health Connection and mailed to the marketplace. So if you don't get around to applying for somebody until the second or third day that they're in the hospital, the emergency Medicaid services, even if somebody is approved for them, are not going to go back and cover a time period before the application was submitted. And like I said earlier, it is usually the first, second day that are the most expensive. Now I know that it's not always possible to get somebody to sign. I know people come into the ER unconscious or incapacitated such that they can't sign for themselves. And that's why it's important to understand who can sign an application for an applicant. So let's move on to step 5. You're going to place copies of the application and proof of fax. Always save that proof of faxing, including the date and time this was done in the patient's records, so in whatever database that you use. Step 6, if proof of income was not submitted with the application Tennessee Health Connection, provide the applicant with the Tennessee Just Center 10-Care Income Verification handout, which again is on Appendix 3. Have the patient provide copies of pay stubs, if any, or proof of other income from all household members for the last 8 weeks. So if somebody doesn't have income, if there is no income in that household, don't ignore any request from 10-Care to provide proof of income. It still needs to be responded to. And, even if somebody doesn't have income, get a statement from them saying, I have no income. Since this date, to present in time, I have no income, I haven't worked. And then once you've received this proof of income from the patient, fax copies to Tennessee Health Connection as outlined in the steps for submitting subsequent documentation section, which is coming up. And you should not wait for an official request from 10-Care before faxing Tennessee Health Connection. That's our advice to you. The main point is that we get these applications through in as little time as possible, so that the provider gets his reimbursement and also that the applicant never has to be sent to collections. So stay a step ahead of them. You're most likely going to know that 10-Care is going to need proof of income, proof of immigration status possibly, if relevant. So get those things and send them to them before they even have to request them. Okay, going on to page 7. Step 7, calculate and record the date 45 calendar days from the application date in the patient's file. This is the application deadline date, the deadline imposed by federal regulations within which the state must decide whether to approve the application. If that's not done, if you don't have a determination within 45 days, then you guys know to file a delay appeal. Okay, so then step 8 is to have the patient sign 10-Care's medical release form. That's Appendix 4. Add the form to the patient file. You may need this form in the future. And then step 9, follow up with the patient on the date that you set in step 4, that marks the end of the 45-day time period for an eligibility determination. Also inform the patient to notify of you of any requests for information denials, or etc., and record that in the patient's file. If after 45 days a decision has not been rendered on the application, complete the TennCare eligibility appeal form, and that's on Appendix 5. We do not have this appeal form in Spanish. We have requested it from the state, but as of now, we only have Appendix 5 in English. Check the box indicating the application is delayed in Section 5, and note the application date in Section 7. And then attach the following documents: the EMS application cover sheet, the application and proof of the application date, which can be proven by fax receipts and or certified mail receipts, medical records establishing the sudden onset of an emergency medical condition, and then finally medical bills associated with the medical services. And some people might say, what is Part D all about? There's not like a limit. You know, somebody has to have had an emergency situation that costs, you know, $100,000 or more in order to be eligible for emergency Medicaid. That's not a requirement. So what's that D about? I've had this happen before. It can sometimes make or break whether or not somebody is eligible for emergency Medicaid in the context of what if the only open category that the applicant's going to be eligible for is medically needy spin down. Say this is a child who's in the 5-year bar, and her parents, you know, have income such that she's not going to be eligible for TennCare. If she incurs enough medical debt on the first day, second day, whenever, of admission to the hospital, then they're going to need to see itemized bills detailing how much each day costs, so that TennCare can figure out when to start the emergency Medicaid coverage based on eligibility for medically needy spend down. So moving on to Step 11, fax this appeal and all its attachments to Tennessee Health Connection at 1-855-315-0669 and place copies of the fax receipt in the patient's file. Obtain proof mailing or the fax receipt as proof and record in the patient's file. And then record patient information in the log report of pending emergency Medicaid appeals and dispositions for your entity or organization. Step 3 is, if that application is denied or if it is approved but with an effective coverage date later than the date on which the application was mailed to the FFM in London, Kentucky, file an appeal with TennCare through Tennessee Health Connection by completing and faxing the TennCare eligibility appeal form, which is Appendix 5. Submit that proof of the application was filed on an earlier date. Submit documentation of the patient's household composition and income as well. You're not really sure possibly why they were denied, if it was a categorical denial, financially they didn't meet a TennCare category. So submit all of that. And then also send the TennCare release from Appendix 4, an authorization of a representative organization in Appendix 1 to Tennessee Health Connection, and ask for the hospital to be copied on any communications related to the eligibility appeal. Step 14, contact the patient and ask him to respond promptly to any request for information regarding the appeal, and to notify hospital staff whenever he receives a communication from TennCare or the marketplace. Excuse me. Okay, and then step 15 on page 7 of the toolkit. In some instances, TennCare rejects eligibility appeals for failure to raise a valid factual dispute. In these cases, you know, feel free to talk to Tennessee Justice Center, because this gets kind of legally sticky. But the appellant receives a notice, and we have a copy of that notice in Appendix 6, dismissing his request for a hearing because, quote, you did not tell us about a mistake that, if you're right, means you are eligible for TennCare, end quote. This notice allows only 10 days for the appellant to submit additional information to TennCare in writing. And if a patient receives this notice, please, again, contact us for assistance. Okay, so those are the steps for how to apply. Let's move into how to submit documentation, the final section of this webinar. And I am on page 8 of the toolkit. So after the original application has been mailed to the FFM and faxed to Tennessee Health Connection, chances of additional documentation will be created that supports the application, such as a medical record. This could be additional physician notes, laboratory notes, billing, income verification, etc. So the steps below are something we created to increase the chances of complete reimbursement for medical services, and this is dependent on, again, proving the second and third prong that this is an emergent situation and they were sudden onset as a medical condition. So step 1, use TennCare's Emergency Medical Services cover sheet, and again, that is Appendix 2. And always write, EMS application on every page of your fax. 2 is writing EMS application, and then 3, whenever faxing additional information to Tennessee Health Connection, include everything that you've sent them before. If it's your first time that you're faxing information to them, include the original application. If it's your second time, include the original application and everything that you need to send that's new, perhaps proof of income, proof of mailing. You have that signed return receipt. And then anytime you get information moving forward, whether it's physician's notes or proof of income, always send everything over again to TennCare, to Tennessee Health Connection, each time you fax to them. So that's the main takeaway. We've seen the way that internally the communication system works at Tennessee Healthcare Finance Administration, and there's not always, guarantee that the person at the appeals unit or at Tennessee Health Connection are going to have the same information. Sometimes one fax gets added, but not another fax. You want to make sure that every time you're faxing information, it has everything you've ever sent in case it is the only fax that gets added to the patient's record. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the webinar, the content of the webinar. There are still some helpful resource contact information on page 8 and 9 of your toolkit. Mailing addresses and fax numbers on page 9, and then there's a table of contents, the appendix. We recommend that you make copies of these appendices so that you can use them with each patient. You don't have to run around trying to find, oh, what's that appendix 1? I need a new copy of it now. Just keep them in bulk. These are mostly, at least appendix 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 are pages that TennCare themselves created. The only document that we've included in the toolkit that's kind of a TJC rogue form is Appendix 3, and this is based on information that's in the TennCare policy manual of what counts as proof of income. So more resources for you guys. TennCare did a webinar on emergency medical services back in the summer 2015. The recording of that webinar, some Q&As, and other resources can be found on their TennCare topics page. I included the URL to that in this webinar. Also, if you guys prefer to have the, you're not going to use the TJC toolkit, but just want to have the EMS cover sheet and HCFA authorized representative organization forms that you can print and use as needed. I included links to both of those. Okay, so that is it. We have time for some questions, and I will, if you guys give me a minute, read through some of these and see what I can answer now. Okay. So we have one request to send the information on who can sign the application after the training. I absolutely will do that because that's an important piece of applying for emergency Medicaid services. And the only other question I have received is emergency Medicaid for non-citizens only? And the answer to that is the emergency Medicaid is not going to be for somebody who is eligible for 410 care. So if you're a citizen, or if you have a green card and you've had it for 5 years, or if you have another qualified status such that you could apply for 10 care today and be approved for it, then you're not going to be eligible for emergency Medicaid. Emergency Medicaid is for people who couldn't submit a 10 care application and be approved for 10 care specifically because they either don't have an immigration status or their immigration status is insufficient, so that maybe they have a work visa and they're here with that non-immigrant status. They don't specifically plan to stay, and actually the conditions of their work visa mean that they have intention to return home. So I've seen applications done for people who would otherwise be eligible for 10 care, but providers or the individuals are applying for emergency Medicaid because they realize they only need to apply for insurance once they're at the hospital. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't still submit a 10 care application simply because they're not going to be eligible for emergency Medicaid. Still submit a 10 care application because these people might be eligible for full 10 care that won't just cover that time they were in the ER, that will cover them for possibly up to 12 months. So there is a different route to applying for 10 care for somebody who is a citizen or has a qualified immigration status that they could be eligible for full 10 care. And it's different than the emergency Medicaid application process. But we have seen before, specifically, I had a client once who was a minor who would have been eligible for 10 care as a minor, but he didn't have his Social Security number when he arrived at the ER. He's a citizen born here in the U.S., and he didn't know his Social Security number. I think I didn't even remember mine until I went to college. But the hospital submitted a paper application. They faxed that to Tennessee Health Connection for him, and Tennessee Health Connection responded back saying, you're not eligible for emergency Medicaid. This is only the application process for emergency Medicaid. And we've been in an appeal process for that case for a couple months now. We had the hearing for it a couple weeks ago. But our argument for that is, 10 care should accept an application by all reasonable means, whether online, by fax, in person, or by phone, and that they should count that paper application fax to 10 care as an attempt to apply for 10 care, even if the individual didn't follow the regular 10 care application process. Instead, they filed the emergency Medicaid 10 care process. So that's a long answer, but in sum, yes, emergency Medicaid is only going to be for people who are ineligible for 10 care based on immigration status. It has its own application process, but if you do have somebody who comes into your hospital and they need to apply for full 10 care, it's still in the hospital's best interest to submit an application, because as soon as somebody applies for 10 care, as long as they're eligible, 10 care should go back and cover that stay at the hospital without any kind of requirement that it's at an onset or that it's an emergent situation. But, just because the person's eligible for 10 care should cover that visit. Let's see. So if they're citizens and in the gap and have a life-threatening condition, then they can't apply. So if somebody's a citizen and in the coverage gap, they're not going to be eligible for emergency Medicaid. This is not a category of 10 care that will cover them. That's correct. And if there are any more questions, please go ahead and send those in. We have about 1 more minute. And I do want to mention one more thing that came up recently and was kind of news to TJC. We do Medicaid law, and sometimes the overlap between immigration law and Medicaid law is pretty convoluted. So it recently came to our attention that there could be some immigration implications for somebody who is a non-immigrant applying for services like Cover Kids for pregnant women or emergency medical services while they have that non-immigrant status, such as a work visa or, you know, a visitor's or traveler's visa. And again, that goes back to the conditions of that visa. The conditions are that, you know, they are saying that they intend to return back to their home and not stay here in Tennessee. So when somebody applies for emergency medical services or Cover Kids, they do have to attest the state residence, which some you know, consular and immigration offices, DHS, Department of Homeland Security offices, see that as contradictory to the conditions of the visa. So I have heard reports recently of people being asked if they have received EMS or Cover Kids during pregnancy while they had a non-immigrant status to repay those services. And this should really only occur if the person is applying for a visa to return to the U.S. in the future. Since they violated the condition of one visa, they might be considered inadmissible until they right the wrong of the other visa stay. So I hope that's clear, and we are out of time, so I'll stop there. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and I hope you guys have a great rest of the day.